is a great turnout for an important conversation. I've gotten to know both of our speakers a little bit over the last year and a half or so, and I have been a great admirer of their work. And so when we were putting together our program for this conference, they were high on my list of coveted speakers to come talk about an important topic. And it's really about the cost of segregation and what are our solutions to breaking the patterns of segregation that were created by those malintended policies and practices of years gone by. To me, this is a cutting edge work in terms of thinking about how we create a new normal and a new sense of equity. And so we've got some terrific folks here today. I'm not going to read their bios in detail. They are all on your app, which I know everyone is using and loving. But let me introduce our speakers. Kendra Freeman is a manager at the Metropolitan Planning Council in Chicago, where her responsibilities include supporting the Cost of Segregation project. Some very important research that she will share with us today. Prior to joining the council, Kendra held leadership positions in the private and nonprofit sector with a focus on affordable housing and capacity building. She is a native of Chicago, and we met last year when you went on a learning journey around the country looking at places that have become less segregated over time to figure out what some of the strategies were that worked. Christy Myers is the managing director at Opportunity Dallas, an organization which seeks to promote greater economic mobility and prosperity by tackling concentrated poverty and segregation through a comprehensive approach to mixed income housing. I mean, don't these two people sound like my sisters? Prior to joining Opportunity Dallas, Christy worked at Neighborhood Up Dallas and at Dallas ISD. She is a Michigan native. In just a moment, they will share their work and tell you a bit about their efforts. After getting grounded in the research, we're going to talk about what can and should be done. I'll ask a few questions, and then we will open the floor up for questions. I'd like to start with a quote from the Opportunity Dallas website. If we want to improve economic mobility and prosperity, we must tackle concentrated poverty and segregation. With that, we'll turn it over to Kendra to get started.
Great. Thanks, Carol. I'm going to come up to the podium so I don't hit anybody as I throw my arms around, because sometimes I'm animated when I talk. But I just want to say thanks to Carol and to Purpose Built Communities for inviting me to be here. Again, we met last year when we were doing some study trips to kind of understand and ground truth some of the policies and practices we were studying around reducing segregation. And it was great to be able to travel. Oh, okay. It was great to be able to travel to see what's going on in East Lake in Atlanta, and also it was great yesterday to be able to travel and see what's going on quite here locally in Orlando. So the Metropolitan Planning Council is a regional planning and policy change organization, and we've been working in the Chicago region for over 80 years. MPC kind of has a reputation for bringing together community and businesses and elected officials to really work together to solve some of our largest regional problems. And the Cost of Segregation is a 2-year study that grew out of our housing advocacy work. And then one of the things one of the reasons why we did this study is because as we begin to see just a distribution of affordable housing in our region being influenced by our legacy of segregation, we knew it was important to really understand why that was happening and to really shine a light on the decisions or indecisions that were being made that was causing this continual pattern of concentrated segregation and concentrated inequity. And our theory was really around, how do we disrupt the status quo? There's kind of been this default of, it's easier, it's less expensive, to do housing this way. But we wanted to kind of challenge that status quo and really look at what is it costing us to do nothing, to kind of continue in this pattern. And so that was one of the primary goals of the study, to think about what is it costing us to live as we're living, so separately by income and by race. The other goal of the work is to really begin to change the way we talk about segregation. And often when we think about or talk about segregation, it's commonly in relation to people of color, and concentrated poverty. But we often don't talk about what segregation means on the other side, so concentrated white communities and affluence. And often when we don't kind of talk about both sides of the problem, we inadvertently give white affluent communities kind of a pass to think that segregation isn't their problem. So the goal is to broaden the conversation so that we can all talk about and understand segregation in a different way and understand that it's affecting all of us. So our process, we started the study in 2015, just with a small group of advisors, academic advisors, and researchers trying to figure out what the methodology would look like. In 2017, and part of the 2015 was understanding who our partners were going to be. So we partnered with the Urban Institute, which is a research organization out of Washington, D.C. And Urban really took on a lot of the heavy lifting around the quantitative analysis of this study. So in March in 2017, we released our first report, which is the Cost of Segregation, which really looks at what is it costing us. And kind of concurrently, as that report was coming out, we were beginning to look at the second question is what do we do about it? So looking at different policy solutions, working with different groups of people on the ground, practitioners, policy people, community organizations to understand what are some solutions. And then earlier this year in May, we released our second report, which is called our Equitable Future, which we consider to be a roadmap for the region in thinking about how do we reduce our levels of segregation. So two main research questions. We think about this work in kind of two phases. Phase one, what is it costing us? Phase two, really, what do we do about it? So the big question, what is it costing us? Again, this was part of a national study. So what Urban Institute did was they looked at 100 of the largest metropolitan regions across the country to begin to do an analysis of segregation. So we looked at three different types of segregation: Black-white segregation, Latino-white segregation, and economic segregation. Urban crunched those numbers in order to kind of begin to think about what's the median point. So in looking at this study, we weren't saying that we need to go to zero segregation from where we are. We were just trying to understand what would it look like if we got to a median point. And so Urban took those different levels of segregation and measured them across a number of different variables, things like median income, life expectancy, homicide rates, and the results were varied. But there were three results that popped out that were statistically significant, and all of them had to do with our levels of Black-white segregation. So I'm going to talk about each of those, but just in summary, the three were lost income, lost lives, and lost potential. So in looking at lost income, the first point, so we see if we reduced our levels of segregation just to that median point, that there is a difference. There's a direct loss of income for African Americans, and that's almost about $3,000 annually for African Americans. But when we look at what that means for the entire region, it's a much bigger picture. So when we look at the loss to the entire region, in terms of lost revenue, it's $4.4 billion in income that we would be losing, and up to $8 billion is our gross domestic product. So we started with kind of like that micro, how does it affect individually, but it was important for us to tell a broader story about how it's affecting all of us, not just African American individuals who are losing income. So the second point was lost lives. The other thing we saw is Black-white segregation increases, homicide rates increases, and that came from looking at those different metropolitan areas across the region. So what does that mean for Chicago? If we reduced our African American and white segregation just again down to that median point, then we would have seen, if you remember in 2016, Chicago had a really high homicide rate, over 700 murders. We would have seen a 30% drop in our homicide rate. And you can't begin to put a cost on human life, but just a visualization of that is 30% lower homicide rate in 2016 would have mean 229 lives that would not have been lost. And there are other implications of that as well. So when you start to think about other costs, it's related to homicide rates, things like the lost income of people who would have lived, who weren't murdered. That is estimated about $170 million over the course of people's lifetimes of income lost. When you think about the impact on policing costs and court costs, again, $65 million in policing costs, $218 million in correctional costs. And also we've seen research that suggests, the relationship between homicide rates, lower homicide rates, and higher property values. So we're also looking at the cost and property values. So we see a number of different ways economically that a lower homicide rate would have had benefited the Chicago region. And then the final main point is what we're calling loss potential. So as we see segregation increasing, we also see lower educational attainment. So what does that mean? In the Chicago region, it means 83,000 more people would have been able to attain bachelor's degrees. And this is an interesting statistic too, because when we see lower segregation, we saw the educational attainment go up, not just for African Americans or people of color, but it went up across all racial groups. So that is, again, another powerful illustration of how inequity impacts all of us. So again, when we think about the amount that we're losing out in lost lifetime incomes, with that extra level of educational attainment, it's estimated some $90 billion. So just to give you some context of nationally, how some of the cities were ranking, again, Urban looked at 100 of the largest metropolitan areas. This is a map that shows some of the most segregated areas, and probably no surprise to many of us in this room, places like Philadelphia, Bridgeport, New York, Milwaukee, and Chicago. What we also found was really interesting was there seemed to be some pattern in some of these cities, particularly in the northern Rust Belt cities, of places that were also main points of destination during the Great Migration. So in a lot of ways, the way cities kind of made decisions about how they received large influxes of African American population contributed to this legacy of segregation that we see now. So phase two is answering the big question, what do we do? Now that we know that we're not, benefiting from this segregated situation, what can we do about it? And how can we begin to drive an equity agenda? One of the other things that was significant from the study too is not just the levels of segregation and the economic impact, but kind of the pace that we're on. So one of the things that came out in the study is if the Chicago region kind of stays where we are, kind of at the status quo, we won't even reach a median endpoint, just that median point of segregation until 2070. So considering what it's costing us, we're moving way too slow, and that was another impetus to really push this work forward. So just understanding how we kind of got to these policy recommendations, we did a lot of work. We talked to a lot of people. We looked at national best practices. Again, we took study trips and learned from places like Atlanta. We learned from places like Seattle, who've done a lot of work of embedding equity into their governments. And then we kind of took it on the road. We came up with our theories and our ideas for policy change, and we met in different areas of the region, because Chicago is a very different place. I mean, you have the city, and then you have the 7 county regional areas, and depending on where you are, it could be very different places, very different perspectives. It was important for us to meet with practitioners, housing professionals, government officials to understand how these ideas would land in their communities, how they could work in their communities, and really understand how we needed to tweak them so that we really had a product that would speak across the region and not just to one kind of footprint. In addition, we did in-depth interviews, we had focus groups, we did a survey to which we got a little over 100 responses, and we really tried to make this a collaborative process throughout. So where we came to were 2 major recommendations that kind of guides what you'll find in the roadmap. And on some of the tables, there's cards on the tables, which has a website address where you can actually dig deeper into both of the studies there. But the first major recommendation is how do we begin to, across all of our sectors, dismantle the institutional barriers that create disparities and inequities by race and by income. So the major recommendation here is that all sectors should be adopting what's called a racial equity framework. So how can we begin to look at within our own institutions to examine our policies and our processes and understand the inequities that we may be helping to create or helping to sustain, whether they're intentional or unintentional, and we need to begin to look at how we begin to dismantle that. And that was the primary recommendation, which really comes from the notion that we started talking about segregation, but really what we're talking about is how do we disrupt structural racism. And then the second recommendation, we're thinking about kind of in different buckets. So very there's 24 different recommendations that we feel like are kind of low-hanging fruit. The first one is very much about systemic change. The second one is more about what can we do right now to make some immediate impact in some of the communities. So we bucket them in areas like economic development, creating jobs and building wealth, inclusive housing, equity in education, and reforming the criminal justice system. And those look in very specific terms, looks like things like for the city of Chicago to adopt an earned income tax credit for working households. And that's one, what we feel like is a relatively easy push for the city, and it would create more than $218 million in additional spending and essentially money in working people's pockets. Another one is eliminating the use of the cash bail system, which we know contributes to the pipeline to prison and indiscriminately impacts people of color and communities of color, particularly African American men in Chicago. And a third one is increasing options for people on housing choice vouchers, so people using Section 8 vouchers. Particularly, we're advocating for a 33% income increase in allowable rents. And just having that 33% increase in allowable rents, at least in the Chicago region, will open up over 3,000 more housing units that now are inaccessible for people who are using housing choice vouchers. So I am going to stop there and look forward to talking more in conversation.
Thank you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So as Carol mentioned, my name is Christy Myers. And first, I just want to say thank you. One, to purpose-built communities. I believe there was a time not too long ago, and in many conferences still, who would never, ever put segregation in the title of a panel. So
Yeah.
One, thank you for that. And it really impresses me as well that you saw that there was a topic about segregation and you chose to come and sit in on it. So thank you both. That's a big, big, huge shift. I am going to try and talk about the work of Opportunity Dallas through a couple of stories that are both personal to me and who I think shape the work of what it is that we're trying to do, both through Opportunity Dallas and, quite frankly, in the city and across the country. I wanted to start this session by cueing the start of the Dallas TV show. You know, they come in, they show you the big gold buildings. But I didn't do that because I think that a lot of times that's what we think about when we think about Dallas. That is the land of opportunity, that it's the land of the great, that we oftentimes forget what might really be going on, not only again in the city of Dallas, but across the country. If you Google definitions of segregation, you will find 7.8 million results. I think it's interesting because just a couple of weeks ago I was doing another speech for a different topic about leadership, and you find almost the same number of results when you Google leadership. But if you look at the definition of it, it literally says to set the stage, the action or state of setting someone or something apart from other people or things. I can't read that definition and it not crawl through my skin. It bothers me, it feels wrong, it feels divisive, but it's absolutely our state, both in Dallas and across the country. You'll hear about this in just a couple of minutes, but there's some students that I've been mentoring for several years, and one of them lives in the heart of southern Dallas, which is where we are the tale of two cities, north and south is where the majority of our poverty lives. And she said when she was asked a question about segregation and what it's done to her, she says, "Segregation cost me exposure. I lived 5 minutes from downtown, but never really had the chance of seeing it when I was growing up. There was public transportation connect us, but we never really felt connected. Segregation caused me to limit my dreams. Rarely did I ever see African Americans in high-powered positions. I saw them sweeping the floors at my school or serving me food through a fast food window. This caused me to believe that the American dream was not feasible for people who looked like me. Segregation cost me opportunities. In schools that were surrounded by impoverished communities, opportunities came once in a blue moon. There were not a whole lot of people to come in and invest in us. That has caused generational curses of broken dreams and hopelessness. Students often saw themselves as a non-entity, and their aspirations reflected such. Dallas is one of the most residentially segregated places in America. It has the second highest child poverty rate among large U.S. cities, second to Philadelphia. 1 in 3 children live in concentrated poverty. Only 4% of public schools in Dallas are racially and socioeconomically diverse, which we have 227 of. In 73 of the 79 high opportunity areas, which I don't even think I have to define for you, are majority white and not a, 73 of the 79 high opportunity areas in the city are majority white and not a single high opportunity area is majority black. Opportunity Dallas founder Mike Kaprowski, who I hope several of you have followed his work and continue to follow his work now that he's in DC, he said it best. He said, "The scale and depth of Dallas's poverty is obscene, morally and economically unacceptable, and abnormally high compared with other major cities. We are replete with maps, reports, commissions, and commentary that identify the problem and rightly express outrage. But here's the harsh reality. Despite the anti-poverty rhetoric, we continue to maintain the very structures and systems that cause and perpetuate poverty in the first place." Carol had mentioned it before. I was born and raised in Flint, Michigan, who everyone always asks, oh, the Michael Moore video. Yes, the Michael Moore video. And now today, no more so for the water crisis, which is real. But the long story short is we went like this on a map, and the biggest city in the warmest climate was Dallas, and up and moved everything to Dallas. And I will say that the winters are much better. But when I started in Dallas, I worked for the Dallas Regional Chamber in the education space. I went to public school, K through 12, and this was my first real exposure into what urban public education looked like. There was a school we went into, and I remember looking at my boss and saying, "Patty, kids go to school here?" And she said, "Yes." And so that was the beginning of this trek of really digging into figuring out the inequities that existed inside of our city. I spent the next 2 years at the Dallas Regional Chamber, and like any good millennial, you see a problem and you think that you can fix it, and so you go and work for that entity. So I then went and worked for Dallas ISD for the next 4 years, specifically in community engagement and in Southern Dallas. And I had mentioned before, but it's really important to remember the divide of North and South. It's like Chicago. We think of the big city. We don't think of all the other surrounding suburbs, but it's very real, the divide between North and South Dallas. And so when I think about the answer to the question of what does segregation cost us, it was through that lens that the first thing segregation is really costing us is relationships. Throughout my time when I was at Dallas ISD, I was selected to be a part of what's called Mayor's Star Council. Long story short, Mayor selects 24 young people to put into a group. For an entire year, you learn a whole lot about civic engagement. You learn about the city. You learn about the underbelly of the city. And one of the tasks was that he wanted us to start a leadership council for our kids who were in Southern Dallas. And so we 4 of us sat in a room and we said, this sounded like a really good idea when we raised our hands. What do we do now? So we did. We ended up, we put together a year-long of curriculum. We selected kids from 5 Southern Dallas high schools, 10 kids from each of them, and we said, we don't really know what we're doing, but we want to put you through some cool experiences, and we hope that we can teach you a little bit about being leaders of change in your communities. So we asked the students when they were first starting to complete an application, and we said, what is downtown Dallas to you? Remember, I had just traveled from Michigan because this was the land of opportunity, but our very own said the absolute opposite. They said it's a place we can see but we cannot access. That's the place where they make the decisions to bulldoze our home. There wasn't a dry eye in the room reading the reality of what these kids had put in writing. We dug in with them. We gave them $30,000 to design and paint murals in their neighborhoods. We took them to some of the coolest places in the city. We graduated them after a year. We gave them iPads and backpacks, sent them on their way. In the following fall, we began to onboard a new class, and lo and behold, that previous class came back, and they said, "Will you stay with us?" We said, "Sure." We don't have any curriculum, but sure. But for us, this was part of the bigger story, because in these disinvested communities, we were the only consistent thing that they had seen for a year long, and the thought of us being absent was more than a lot of them could handle. You see, these kids come from the very communities that we're talking about. They have been given the poorest quality of housing, the poorest education, the poorest transportation options to try to even get to summer work, living in high crime areas because of the segregation that exists in our city. They didn't have consistency. We were the first thing that they saw, but it took us showing up time and time again for them to believe that we meant what we said and that we were going to work hard to break and dismantle the system of segregation so that they had a better opportunity. Today we have sophomores from high school to juniors in college. People ask us on a regular basis, how in the world is this sustainable? It's probably not. I will give them everything that I have, and we will do everything that we can, because the cusp of how to begin tearing down segregation is through one intentional relationship at a time and the collective commitment to building a community better than the one we left. After the first year of graduates, which was 3 years ago, I left Dallas ISD and I went to work for the mayor, which I am lucky to have 2 of my past board members here today. And he had rolled out a plan to focus on growing the tax base in southern Dallas in place-based and specific geographic areas. And so to me, that was a great opportunity to leave what my students had just charged and said, we're living in a segregated city, now what are you gonna go do about it, Mama Christie? And I said, okay, here we go. So I went and I took that role, and this is what brings me to the second thing that segregation has cost us, economic and neighborhood development. Segregation is a driver of poverty. It isolates families from assets, resources, transportation, institutions, employment, healthcare. To get from downtown Dallas to the neighborhood I was working in was a 16-minute drive. On public transit, it took 1 hour and 24 minutes. 1 hour and 24 minutes. No, really. I thought it was a good idea to prove a point, and so I decided to ride public transit every day for several months in the Texas heat, and to write and share the story of what our neighbors were required to deal with, and quickly discovered the inequities in just our transit system that was built for transit-dependent folks. Segregation is a poverty trap. A city that fails to integrate its schools shouldn't be surprised when poverty hits crisis levels. That was another quote from our former founder, Mike Kaprowski. Earlier I had said, or talked about one of our students from Mayor's Rising Star Council. One of the things I didn't mention was that after 3 years of the program, we decided that it was time to call our own selves out. And like you had mentioned before, what are you going to do about the white communities? And so we added Lake Highlands High School, which is a high school in far north Dallas, because we wanted the students to start giving us their solutions about how we're going to start bridging the gap between north and south. One of the students that we met during that process, her name is Barbara Reynosa. She's currently a senior at the high school. We met her 2 years ago, bashful, so bashful, stood behind the others. She was always the last to speak up. But the persona about her made you want to dig in and find out more. Later, she ended up sharing her story with us. Her father left her and her family when she was a baby, and she was there when her mother committed suicide. She's now being raised, her and her 4 other siblings, by her 25-year-old sister, who is not her legal guardian, who is now running into all kinds of trouble with how to apply for financial aid. I only tell you this because when we start to add north and south, you start to understand that there are real inequities in both that are valued from each other's stories. Today, she is one of the youth commissioners for the city. She's traveled to DC to advocate for local policies, but in a meeting recently, we were talking about strong development. I said that poverty is costing us good neighborhood development. She lived in an area where several of the community members were advocating for new growth. And so they did that. They ended up getting a TIF, or there was a TIF, and so inside of it they got a new Sprouts, which is a grocery store. They got some really great housing. They got several restaurants. They now have a Starbucks, a Chase Bank, a hair salon. Well, Barbara and her family lived there. Barbara and her family don't live there now. And she came up to me and she said, it's great when we talk about good economic development, but y'all have always taught us to speak up for what it is that we believe is wrong, which I will tell you has really come back and bite me so many times. But she said my family and I had to move, and where they ended up moving to was the intersection that remains in the top 5 most dangerous parts of the city. Because while the economic development is really productive for a lot of us who sit in this room, it displaces a whole lot of people, and it continues to perpetuate the problem. She then ended up getting the school boundary. She then was going to be at a different school for her senior year, and so we had to advocate for her to stay at that high school. But that's what it's costing us. The third thing, which is my last thing, segregation is costing us is trust. Several of you can see me. Not only do I have Wonder Woman shoes on, which I promise they're part of the story. I don't normally just wear those. I'm a white woman. Being a young white woman in the city of Dallas is no short feat. On one side, it's a white man's world, and on the other side, it's a predominantly African-American world whose wounds refuse to let any white, especially me, in. But why should they? So many have come before me, come with all the answers and all the promises in the world. I used to get posted on social media about daily, which my parents are actually here, which is the first time in 10 years they've ever been in a room with me because they live in Michigan and I live in Dallas. And my dad would call and text every day and be like, why are these people saying this about you? I would say, Dad, I don't know either, but we're just gonna get through it. I had microphones taken out of my hands at meetings. I had people hired to just follow me to meetings to try and get under my skin enough to leave. And then I met this sweet woman. Her name is Miss Myrtle. She was from Southern Dallas. I went around the room. I shook everyone's hand. I came to Miss Myrtle, who's a long time. She was on City Planning Commission. She was, you name it, she held that position in the city, so highly, highly regarded. She didn't want a thing to do with me. I went up to her. I extended my hand. Said, well, it's nice to meet you, but it was in my heart and it was in my chest and it bothered me so much. So several months later, I tricked her into meeting me. And so her and a friend ended up meeting with me, and we were talking about something, and she started to raise her voice at me, and I gently started to raise my voice back at her, and she stopped and she said, oh, you're serious, Christy? I said, yes, ma'am, I am. I said, I've been trying to tell you that, but you weren't listening. But she needed me to keep showing up and know that I wasn't just like the ones before. You're likely wondering why I'm speaking about her in past tense, as I must have lost her trust somewhere. But that sweet woman passed away suddenly earlier this year, and when her funeral was being arranged, her daughter called and said, Christy, I've seen my mom with you. You have done something different. And you're white. She went on to ask if I would speak at her funeral, to which I said, absolutely. I stood amongst 22 others, and I was the only white speaker because it was not Miss Myrtle's tendency to trust others who looked like me. But she was willing to trust me because we kept showing up. So what are we going to do about it? There's a lot of data. We have to be really intentional about what we do with the data. We have to understand the power of the relationship. It's about the one. Advocating for strong policy has been the role of Opportunity Dallas. The city of Dallas did not have a comprehensive housing policy. It now has a housing policy that is becoming comprehensive. And there's a lot of work that's being done, and there's so many leaders in the city who are committed to doing it. And really, that's the whole umbrella of, one, how are we telling the story of these communities? But then how are we remaining committed to go into these communities in lockstep with them, not coming in with all of the answers, and letting them guide what the policy says, what is wrong with the policy, letting them be a part of it, because we don't do that. And finally, trust. I'm a firm believer in the I just totally lost my place. I will end here. The student that I had mentioned before at the very beginning, who had talked about the segregation that exists in the city, this spring, she graduates from Texas Tech. And she's just one, because we were committed to going into one, but she's now going into her degree is in sociology, and she plans to go back into her community to teach others how to move out of the system and how to be a part of the system and be a voice for it. I had mentioned these shoes. They have Wonder Woman on the side of them. And if you look up Wonder Woman, we all think about heroes, oh, she's super strong, which she is. I mean, she's strong. But she is fearless, she perseveres, she has strength, she remains curious, but most notably, she believes passionately that it's her duty to dedicate her life to helping those who cannot defend themselves. And I encourage that every one of us in this room, as we approach this from an economic development lens, as we approach this from a relational lens, as we approach this from a trust lens, that we are just committed to doing this because it is our duty to serve those who otherwise cannot fight for themselves. Thanks.
Thank you both. That was both terrific presentations. A couple things as observations as I was listening to you both. Our friend David Erickson, who works for the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank, says that the status quo is both stupid and expensive. And you can pull that up often. And both of you have proven in your experience and your work that continues to resonate. And just because it's the way we've done it in the past, that ought to give us a signal to say, okay, we need to look at it and think about how do we do it better. Patrick Sharkey, who's a sociologist at Columbia University, did some research a few years ago that was published recently, and he looked at the number of black children and white children who lived in concentrated poverty in two different eras. The first era was 1955 to 1970, which was kind of the heart of the civil rights movement. And that was kind of, he said, okay, that's our base level. And what he found there is that 29% of African American children and 1% of white children lived in concentrated poverty. So think about that. Almost a third of black kids, where only 1% of white kids lived in concentrated poverty. Then he said, well, let's look down the road. Let's look from 1985 to 2000, which should have been enough time for the policies and practices that should have emanated out of the civil rights movements with stronger laws and whatnot to take effect. And so he went back and he looked at the data from that era, from 1985 to 2000, and he found out that 1% of white children still lived in concentrated poverty, and now 30% of black kids did. And so what we're saying is that without the intentionality that you bring to this table, things are not going to change. And they're not going to change with any kind of equity. So I think this is important for us all to realize that this doesn't happen without intentionality. So I want everybody here to have a chance to ask some questions, because I think there's going to be a lot of questions that come up. But I wanted to think of, first philosophically. Bryan Stevenson, who wrote Just Mercy and is probably a hero of many of us in this room, said that the opposite of poverty is justice. What do you think the opposite of segregation is?
I guess I can start. So this is an interesting question, because as we started this study, talking about segregation, not that we were thinking the opposite of integration, but we had lots of conversations. What does segregation mean? If we're reducing segregation, are we saying we need more integration? And people had different feelings about that, you know. Some people were like, yeah, definitely integration. And others were like, wait a minute. If you're saying that we need to integrate, are you trying to say there's something wrong with my historically African American community or Latino community or whatever? So I think this study was also, it was a process of inquiry and learning for us, the team that did it as well, in our own kind of challenges as we were going through understanding segregation and what it meant. So certainly when we started this study, we were looking at economic segregation, racial segregation, and what does that mean towards moving towards a more integrated place. I think what we came to was the study really ended up being about race. It really ended up being about inequity, and really ended up being about racial equity. So I guess my answer to that would be the opposite of segregation would be racial equity, because segregation is really just an output of a bigger problem, which is structural racism. And segregation makes it very convenient. You know, it's a tool. It makes it very convenient to disinvest in communities, to have poor education in certain areas. I mean, it's a tool. So really, the opposite, the other end of the spectrum for me is racial equity.
So I would say that the opposite of segregation is relationships. I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done, and oftentimes we try and hurry ourselves to find the quick solution, and we forget the decades and century of segregation that's existed, that it's going to take that amount of time to redo. And so I mentioned several of the different relational moments, but I think it's through the relationships that you start to build trust that you can even start to adopt policy that actually ends up impacting these communities we're talking about.
Opportunity Dallas spent a long time working on policy recommendations that I thought were extraordinary. And were very clear that the goal was to create a housing policy that would end segregation and concentrated poverty. Could you talk to us a little bit about some of the policy recommendations that were embedded in that work?
Yeah, so there were several different values that were brought up during this conversation of in the list of recommendations, what are they actually valued of, and exactly what you're talking about, how do you actually bring in? And so, for example, one of the conversations that just come up this week, a part of that is this use of tools in the toolbox, and how are you productively using the toolbox to promote rather than divide or further divide. And so, for example, just yesterday we spent 8 hours in council and talking about 4% LIHTC deals, and how do you, we're now talking about an area that is 100% poverty, and now there's a deal that could be on the table to help rehab these buildings, and it could give these families a better quality of life, but it doesn't totally go with what the current policy says. And so really being willing to take a position on some of these of, well, do you keep on moving forward with the current policy, or are we really committed to trying to mobilize and move into mixed income neighborhoods? Just hard.
Yeah. So I think there's always that short-term pressure,
yes,
right? About, you know, people, especially when in different markets where there either is or perceived to be an affordable housing crisis. The short-term pressure is we got to build more affordable housing. But if we're not following smart policies, we're just going to recreate a 50-year problem.
Right.
Kendra, I love the example that you pulled out about using Section 8 vouchers differently and funding them at higher levels. Could you tell people, not everybody here knows a lot about that program, could you talk just a minute about what that looks like and the kinds of opportunities it creates for families?
Sure. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program, previously known as Section 8, also known as Section 8, it essentially gives people a mobility voucher to go and rent in the private market. It's like a portable income subsidy where you should be able to take it anywhere and rent anywhere. The challenges in Chicago is how the rent structures are set up, which is very much colored by race and neighborhoods. So in some areas, market rents are much higher than other areas. So there's a ceiling that makes it very difficult if you're, a family of 3 and you're looking for a 2-bedroom to move into what's called a high opportunity area. So where you may have a ceiling, I'll use an example because I actually rent I'm a property owner and I rent in the program. So a 2-bedroom apartment that I rent out, which is in a predominantly African-American neighborhood, the maximum rent on that unit, I think, is $1,100. If you go to the north side in what's considered a higher opportunity area, that same kind of apartment would be probably $2,000, $2,500, depending on where you're looking. So it's relatively impossible unless you're in a special program that's designated for opportunity moves, which has some other kind of hoops you have to jump through to have real housing choice. So really the recommendation is to have kind of right-size the way we look at allocating those those rent ceilings. So it does afford people more choice in more neighborhoods and not kind of relegate them to traditional areas where we see concentration of voucher holders because of lots of reasons, but mainly affordability.
So if we have, that was a great description. If the Housing Authority has a defined sum amount of money towards the voucher program, if they increase the rents that they will pay under the voucher program, it may end up in serving fewer people, but arguably serving people better.
Yes. It's always that rub. I mean, it's like,
these are really hard,
and this is
real
what the Housing Authority says. Like, we're just trying to, serve as many people as possible. But you can't, housing choice vouchers is one of several solutions. It's not just all on the burden of housing choice vouchers. You have to look at, site-based subsidy. You have to look at preserving naturally occurring affordable housing. You have to work towards inclusionary housing. We have an affordable rights ordinance where if the city supports new construction or there's a zoning change, it kicks in a 10% affordable housing requirement. How do we do that better? And another recommendation that we have, which actually recently legislation has been introduced in City Council to support this, is an affordable housing, equity for affordable housing? I always mess up the name of it. But essentially, in Chicago, the end kind of decision for zoning lies with the aldermen. And we have 50 wards and 50 aldermen. I'm always tentative to say this in public because people are like, what? We have this crazy system. But anyway, if there's a project that's coming in and has a certain level of affordable housing, we've seen aldermen say no and hide behind issues of density and safety and overcrowding of schools to reject projects that have affordability in them, a lot of which is on the basis of bias and prejudice and other things. So this new legislation kind of tries to curb that power by saying if your ward is not at least at minimum having 10% of affordable housing representation, then this process has to go through a different process, and that final decision does not lie with the aldermen. So it's a combination of different solutions that needs to be kind of worked on collectively to get to where we're trying to get to.
I have many more questions, but I'm thinking that maybe some of you have some questions you'd like to ask. Arthur?
So my question.
Here, come up and use a microphone.
We have a mic runner.
Just join the stage.
You can use mine right now.
So my question is what the relationship of purpose-built community projects is to segregation. If we think PBC projects as eventually, over a course of 1 or 2 generations, eliminating poverty, if we get rid of poverty, if that actually happens, what happens to segregation? That really 2-part question. The other is, I'm curious what project leaders' experience has been in change of the ethnic, if we get rid of poverty, to get rid of any segregation in these transforming projects.
Was that for me?
I think so.
First part,
Yeah, if you clarify that.
Yeah, the first part of the question, what impact ending poverty has on the impact of segregation. In other words, if we got rid of poverty, you could make the argument perhaps segregation loses its sting. So that's a question for the panel. And then the other question is, has segregation softened in neighborhoods where the mixed income housing is put in place? That's really a question for the project leaders.
Anybody want to jump in?
I'm not sure I know the answer to the first question.
So that's an interesting idea. I don't know that we know the answer to that.
Right.
It's not knowable right now. Whether poverty, thank you, 10 minutes, so if you've got questions, we're going to jump in. I don't know that it's knowable at this stage of the game, and I think we will see over time neighborhoods become more racially integrated, and that may happen slowly. It may happen more quickly in other places, depending on other factors at play, not just what's happening in a particular neighborhood, but what's happening in a larger city and metropolitan area. Another question. Great.
How you doing? Saran Cade. I appreciate you guys coming together to have this conversation. It's terrific. I want to talk about the comment about intentionality, how to be intentional about the work that we're doing. And part of that question has to do with the promotion of ownership. And not just kind of, it's great to talk about affordable rental prices and all these other great things, but when we start talking about generational poverty, you can't talk about it unless you talk about wealth accumulation and passing that wealth on to future generations. And so one of the major downfalls that we mentioned when it comes to redlining and the history of segregation in this country is the impact that it has on your ability to purchase a property, your ability to gain credit, your ability to gain capital, your ability to purchase a business, and your community to actually take advantage of the increased property values that come along with these development projects. At what point and how do we integrate or stop talking about, not stop, but not let it solely become a question of the color of the person who lives next door to me, and more of a question about how do we create environments where we can allow individuals in the community to actually own property, own companies that they can now pass on to future generations in order to break that cycle of generational property.
Anybody want to jump in?
Yeah, so one of the projects that's occurring right now in Dallas is in far southern Dallas, and it's a 260 acres of land where that's exactly what they're trying to do is build single family. And it's a predominantly African American community. And the developer, when they first came to us, said, well, there's no way we're going to ever be able to move, that we're ever going to be able to build in this community. We're not going to get the community support. And it goes back to what we said, well, if you actually spend some intentionality with the community. And so we hosted a community meeting. We had 75 people who came to that meeting who were community neighbors who said, this is exactly what we want. We want to be able to move into single family homes. And now the developer is advocating on that very element of now we've actually got community buy-in that this is exactly what they want. Now, they are certainly dealing with lots of red tape and the banking issues, as you know about, of even how to get their project financed and having to go straight to the state and having to try and use incentives from the city as well. But that is, they're working on building 2,700 units for that very purpose. And I believe that if we can prove that model there, then that's the first of many that can be proved. Again, they're going to have to do it right. But I, at least at this point, believe that they are trying to prove the model that it can, and homeownership is part of the answer in this.
Yeah, and I would say if you dig into our equitable future recommendations, I mean, we purposely did not do kind of, not that relationships and trust and all the things are not important, we purposely did not do kind of like this hearts and minds campaign, you know, because that doesn't always land with people. We were like, we're coming straight for your pocketbooks, you know, we want you to understand how this is like damaging you economically long term. And if you look at some of the recommendations a little bit deeper in the report, there are targeting economic relief, particularly in disinvested areas, and things that we need to do differently, and talking about things like not just home ownership, but how do we support small business and entrepreneurism, and how do we change incentives around allowing access to land acquisition and community-owned development, either through land trust or other venues. So we do try to get at that, and I totally hear you, and that's a big part of the pie, and it's really important to address that.
Right here.
Thank you.
So segregation in the economy, I think it does have a dampening impact on the economy, but in a number of cities, and I'm from Michigan, I work primarily in the city of Detroit, but I work for the state of Michigan, actually, and a number of our cities that have begun to see economic development and growth have begun to experience gentrification in those areas that have been once segregated, but now as investment comes in, it becomes, it's gentrified in the sense that people who were living there now are being pushed out. So what kind of strategies have you worked on to balance the impact of investment in certain communities?
Yeah.
So, one of the roles of Opportunity Dallas, now that the housing policy has been adopted, is to now move forward into what are we going to do next? What is 2.0? And that has been one of the pieces that we've discussed of literally doing an annual report or accountability report on the city, and one of the indicators being gentrification, and how is the current policy either supporting that or not supporting it. I will tell you and I've been following a lot of what's going on in Detroit, and they are ahead of the game in several different ways. But one of the things that I am cautiously optimistic about is opportunity zones and the use of them. But even so, how are we going to use opportunity zones to not do that exact thing? Because if you look at some of the swaths of land, it's scary as to if this isn't done right, if the policy isn't actually supporting good quality mixed income development, then we are going to quickly see gentrification. So our position in that has been, we as an entity want to hold the city accountable on a 6 and on a 12-month basis of this is what the development is doing. The incentives are great, but maybe this incentive is actually perpetuating gentrification rather than helping prohibiting or actually building a community in a mixed income way.
Yeah, very good question. We're already seeing that happening, particularly in Chicago around some Latino neighborhoods like Logan Square. We have that little thing called the Obama Presidential Center that's coming to Woodlawn. So one of the things that we're doing, and also is a recommendation that we're actually beginning to build out, is a tool, community impact assessment tool that begins to look at data and ask different questions and give communities kind of some resources to begin to evaluate future development that may have an impact, that may begin to be a spark for gentrification. So to what extent possible they can try to get ahead of the game in thinking about implementing some strategies. We also have a very strong land bank in the Cook County Land Bank, who have been working very closely at the community level with land banking partnerships to help acquire some of that land and hold it for long periods of time, because that is where a lot of the sensitivities lie in getting acquisition of the land, because you have investors who come in very early and have the ability to sit on parcels for years, 10, 15, 20 years, and then when that movement comes, they don't have to do anything because they already have the land control. So how can we get in front of land control so that it's controlled by a public entity or a community entity, I think is a really big, important part of that conversation, in addition to other methods.
Just going to give a quick shout out to the Eastlake Foundation and the Cousins Family Foundation, who acquired about 20 acres of undeveloped land across the street from Eastlake Meadows back, and then the villages of Eastlake. They probably acquired it 15 years ago. And the expectation was that at some time down the road that would be developed for neighborhood serving retail, because we anticipated that would be the need. What we realized as we got further down the road, that because the neighborhood had become so popular, what we needed was more affordable housing. And so the Eastlake Foundation, CF Foundation, and Columbia Residential are about to break ground on 110 new apartments, 70 of which will be affordable, to make sure that the neighborhood continues to have an adequate supply of affordable housing so people can take advantage of the platform that's been developed. So my message is control the land, control your destiny. Do we have time for one more? No, no more questions. We're being stopped. Well, thank you very much, Kendra and Christy. You guys are great. Thank you so much.